Good morning, Grove Kids and Grove families, and happy Pajama Day. Now, I bet some of you are still in your pajamas, so you don't even have to change to get ready for today. This might be one of my favorite summer fun days ever. Now, my prayer for you this morning is that your family would have conversations that lead you all to Jesus and lead your hearts to learn about Jesus as we learn about a man named Nehemiah and how he helped rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Now, before we take a listen to our Bible story, I want you to help me answer this big question. Who is in control of everything? God is in control of everything in heaven and on earth. So sometimes when we're walking through situations that are a little scary or we might be a little nervous about, we don't have to worry because God is in control of everything and His plans are always good. So go ahead and watch our Bible story and then stick around for a little bit for some family discipleship conversation starters.
God's people had lived in Babylon for 70 years. Then King Cyrus, the king of Persia, took over Babylon and let them go home. Some of God's people went to Judah, but some of them stayed. Nehemiah stayed and worked for the king of Persia. One day, some men came from Judah. Nehemiah asked, "How are God's people doing in Jerusalem?" The men had bad news. The people are in trouble. The walls around Jerusalem are broken down and the gates have been burned down. Nehemiah cried. Then he prayed and fasted. The king noticed Nehemiah and asked, "What's wrong? Why are you sad?" Nehemiah was afraid. No one was supposed to be sad around the king. Nehemiah said, "The city where my ancestors are from is in ruins, and the gates of the city have been burned down." The king sent Nehemiah to Jerusalem. Nehemiah inspected the walls and led the people to start rebuilding the walls and gates. The workers put in doors, bolts, and bars. They cut stones and lifted them into place on the wall, and they filled in gaps and holes. All around the city, people worked side by side. Soon, the wall was half as tall as it had once been. Not everyone was happy that Jerusalem's walls were being rebuilt. Some men who lived nearby were angry. God's people kept working on the walls, but their enemies made a plan to attack them and stop their work. God's people prayed and chose men to guard the walls all day and all night. But the people were discouraged. "Our enemies are everywhere," they said. Nehemiah reminded the people that God was with them. "Don't be afraid. God is great and powerful," Nehemiah said. "Be ready. If our enemies attack us, God will fight for us." Enemies could threaten God's people, but they could not make God's people stop building. Their enemies were not in charge of rebuilding the wall. God was. So God's people went back to work. Some stood guard with weapons, and others worked on the wall. Some men worked with one hand and held a weapon in the other. They were always ready to fight, just in case. Nehemiah was a wise and good leader for God's people while they worked. In just 52 days, the wall was complete. The gates were repaired and the wall was restored. When all of Jerusalem's enemies heard that the wall had been rebuilt, they were afraid because they knew God was with His people. Nehemiah led the people to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem to protect them from their enemies. Jesus came to protect us from our greatest enemy, sin and death. He died on the cross and rose from the dead to rescue everyone who trusts in Him.
So many years ago, Nehemiah led God's people to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem to protect them from their enemies. But what in the world could this story mean for us today? Jesus came to protect us from our greatest enemy, which was sin and death. And remember that he died on a cross and he rose from the dead to rescue everyone who puts their trust in him. Now, parents, grandparents, and families, take a minute to walk through these age-level family discussion starters together. Then stick around to worship with us if you'd like. All right, families, it's time to worship. Now remember, when we worship God, we are praising him and thanking him for how good and incredible he is. So stand up with us and dance and sing all over our city to praise Jesus together. And I'll see you guys next week.